Ladies and gentlemen, today I'm back from my 2-week break of making Zelda videos, and as usual I must thank you for the amount of support on the last Zelda video. Sorry for not covering Zelda over the past couple weeks, but with Origami King gracing our Nintendo Switch consoles and a hefty amount of news to cover over the last month, I simply couldn't let the content go to waste. But today I'm returning to my week on week off format of Nintendo and Zelda videos, and today I'm going to be talking about something many have discussed, but haven't really talked about in depth. How could Breath of the Wild 2 really change the Zelda timeline? I'll be discussing possible endings to the newest game in the series, and more importantly, why it could end like that, along with many other things such as the possibility of geographical changes in future installments. For the last time, thank you for your patience, and let's get into the video. So we know so far that this game seems extremely grand. That seems clear at this point, but what doesn't seem clear is why the Zelda team would actually put thought into the timeline of this series. It's clear that for the most part, it doesn't really matter to Nintendo, much to many theorists' disappointment. But I think that after this game we could really see a dramatic change in the Zelda team's philosophy. I feel this game is readying us to propel the series into the narrative galaxy. Some of you may be thinking this does not seem possible, but let's take a look at some of the stone cold facts. First of all, the Zelda team clearly put time into setting up the timeline back when Skyward Sword released way back in 2011. The game sets the stage for all games after it by delivering the players a storyline revelation that would change the core player's perception of the Zelda universe for years to come. Known as of right now, to be precise. Now, they could have gone through all this effort to create a timeline for absolutely no reason, but I think quite the contrary. That game shows the beginning of the timeline and technically an early arc version of Ganondorf with the inclusion of Demise. And as most of you watching will know, the next game that the Zelda team developed, Breath of the Wild, basically did nothing with the timeline. So much so that the Zelda team were like, you really want to know where in the timeline this game goes? The bottom. Right at the stinking bottom. Please stop asking. And while the placement does make some sense in a way, I fail to understand why they'd put such an influential game down there. Until you realise that the Ganondorf scene in Breath of the Wild 2's trailer looks pretty damn late arc to me, and that got me thinking. What if the last 3 games that have come / are coming out all represent a section of Demise's curse? Skyward Sword obviously symbolising the beginning of said curse, Breath of the Wild showing the hatred and malice given to any recipient of Demise's hatred, thereby symbolising the calm before the storm. Finally making the last game possibly the biggest in the series being the end of Demise's curse. Now, as much as I'd love to give my opinion on Ganondorf stepping down from main villain in the Zelda series, you're not here to listen to my thoughts on the topic. Now, this is what many people believe will happen in the game, but more than likely is that Demise's curse will live on in some sort of form. And if that happens, we could still see a giant change in the development of the titles if the developers really want to realistically keep a consistent canon. We're all well aware by now that Breath of the Wild is an open world game, and if they want to continue to develop open world Zeldas in future, they're going to have to include a consistent geographical nature of Hyrule to make the world genuinely seem real, much like the real world that we're standing on right now. So if we do finally stray away from Demise's curse and Ganondorf, then is it so dumb to end the Zelda timeline, in a sense, and begin anew? This would mean that they could consistently pump out these wide open world games that surprise us just as much as Breath of the Wild did. Or what's more, what if the timeline we've all known for 9 years now is actually still used? They could do this very easily. Currently the Zelda team seem to be working in a certain rotation when it comes to 2D Zelda games and 3D ones. What if they change this rotation in future to a rotation in which it includes 2D Zelda games, more linear 3D Zelda games, and your open world Zelda games? What if after the sequel to Breath of the Wild's roll credits, the developers start work on the next massive Zelda game, the beginning to a new timeline that could include more unique villains, more to the standard of Vati, Majora, Malladus and Bellum, but all of the time. This would let the devs stretch their own creative muscles every now and then, a creative stretch many would call it. That's right, the Zelda timeline could effectively end at the end of Breath of the Wild 2. Now, another theory that I've seen float around the community every now and then is the possibility of yet another timeline split. One much like the time split seen at the end of Ocarina of Time. Personally, I think the other idea is more likely, but I will also entertain the idea as it's always a treat to speculate when another Zelda game is on the horizon. I'll discuss why I don't have much stock in it in a second, but let's discuss the very idea of it. For those who have played Breath of the Wild but don't really go into the lore of the series, I'll explain that at the end of 1998, a game remembered by millions and hailed as one of the best games of all time was released. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. And we didn't know it at the time. I don't even think the devs did. But this game offered a literal split in time. In the timeline, 3 different outcomes were made in that game. First, the most grim, if the hero is defeated. Next, if the hero is victorious and decides to go and live through his childhood. And the final outcome, if the hero is victorious and decides to skip his childhood and keep living as an adult. If you'd like to know what happens in each timeline branch, then I advise you to go and look at the timeline and maybe even play through some games you've missed out on. So, how could this be applied to Breath of the Wild 2? Well, if the time travelling mechanic is utilised as many speculate will be the case, then we could see a very similar path of events. But more likely in my opinion is that the timeline may only split into two different endings. If Ganondorf is defeated or if the hero is defeated. Let's discuss why I really don't think this could be a thing. They've already done one timeline split. It gets a bit too awkward and, just harder to work around. I think the Zelda team are going to play their cards pretty safe when it comes to the timeline nowadays. Now, in the grand scheme of things, imagine if after the trailer we've seen now, after another trailer, seeing another late art Ganondorf, and then finally playing the game. Just imagine if in 5 years time the next Zelda game is teased after an epic battle with Ganondorf in Breath of the Wild 2, and well, it's Ganondorf yet again. I think they would all be pretty disappointed, and I think that the disappointment could be valid depending on the ending of the next game. I really feel as if a new timeline is almost needed to bring some new spice into the games. Imagine if a new timeline is created out of open world Zelda games, and new unique characters are made separate to anything we've ever seen in the Zelda universe. That partnered with 2D and linear 3D games being added within the gaps from the last 3 games in the timeline splits all the way to Breath of the Wild. Especially knowing that the game is set so many years in the future that certain events could have repeated themselves. I have a larger video coming up about how long the Zelda timeline spans in general, but to me, having 2 timelines is the perfect system in my opinion. But you could definitely think otherwise, and I won't argue that point. I just think that seeing geographical changes through open world Zelda games will be very interesting, and could give us insight on what previous heroes and Princess Zeldas did with the kingdom. Or, the Zelda team could completely dismiss all of this as complete taboo, and just keep on pumping out games and just saying that they're too far apart to have geographical symmetries. I guess we'll have to wait until the game after Breath of the Wild 2 in around 8 to 10 years. However your opinion stands on the topic, leave your own thoughts and opinions in the comments. I'll reply to any of the comments. I thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please leave a like rating as it helps new people to see my channel, and subscribe to see weekly Nintendo and Zelda content. Next week I should be displaying my Paper Mario review for all to hear. Keep up with me on Twitter and Instagram on screen right now, and if you're up to this point in the video, comment the timeline is a myth. For the last time, thank you all for taking the time out of your day to watch, and I'll see you next week. Stay safe.